Hello everyone and welcome back. Since I've come into possession of these two CD box sets, the Beatles in mono and the Beatles in stereo, released in 2009, I've been thinking about doing a comparison of sound between the two to try to determine which would be my preferred version of each album. Before starting, I have to acknowledge that this is a topic that has split the Beatles fans community along the years. And there were a lot of strong opinions both ways, mono or stereo. But for me, at least from what I've seen so far and what I've listened to so far, I can only say that although probably a lot of audiophiles, through the virtue of the fact that they have very good equipment and maybe the best versions of Beatles albums released, can with some degree of confidence state that a certain version is superior in quality. For regular people like myself, listening to the albums in different formats and on different systems, I found that there often can be no definitive opinion with regard to each album. Rather, there are albums which overall may sound a little bit better in mono, others which sound a little bit better in stereo, and more often than not, on almost each album that was released in both formats, you can find specific songs which can be perceived as sounding better in mono or stereo for various reasons, many having to do with the way that the records were recorded and mixed initially, with the copies of the masters that they were cut from, potentially also with the involvement of the people who have remastered or remixed some of them in later years. So in conclusion, what you will hear in the next few minutes is my personal opinion based on listening to all of the albums that were released in both mono and stereo, picking 4 or 5 songs off of each album as a main point of reference, and using a decent but barely mid-range Panasonic mini hi-fi system along with a pair of Marshall headphones. I have listened to the songs both using the speakers and on headphones, but one of the conclusions that I can state even now at the beginning of this video is that when listening with a pair of headphones, the differences will be way more pronounced, and most of my findings come from listening through the Marshall headset. Whereas when listening to the albums with the speakers, being at a certain distance from the speakers and them not being too far away from each other, the differences become less distinguishable, at least for my ears. I've listened to the albums in chronological order, and for each song that I was listening to and comparing, I put in first the mono version and then the stereo version. Sometimes I had to switch back between the two just to see if I've missed something or if one of my impressions from the first listen was potentially inaccurate. As a heads up, the songs that I've picked are not necessarily the biggest hits of the albums, nor are they the best rated songs by critics or fans. Many of them might indeed be some of the most influential that the Beatles had, but for others I just picked tracks I liked or tracks that I thought had a very specific or particular sound, which I believed would be interesting to hear in both versions. Also worth mentioning that I did not choose only Beatles written pieces. A few of the ones that I chose are covers that have been recorded across the first few albums. And it's just because I love them or I thought that some of them sounded interesting enough to be a part of this exercise. Finally, I did try to have a mixture of ballads and softer acoustic tracks, as well as more rock and roll type songs, along with some of the more heavily orchestrated pieces or experimental psychedelic sounding tracks from the later albums. To keep these videos a bit more compact, we've decided to cover the subject in 3 episodes, first one being today, and we're going to be looking at the first 4 albums up to Beatles For Sale. The second episode will include Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, and the final one will include the rest of the albums and general conclusions. So, without further ado, let's start with the Beatles' first record. Before we start, just to tell you that we're going to place the albums on the table like you see them now. We're going to have the mono on the right side with the front cover facing to the camera, and then we're going to have the stereo albums on the left side with the back of the cover, because most if not all of the stereo albums have the track list, so it will be easier for you to see it as well. Please me, for this album I've listened to 4 songs in both mono and stereo. The songs were A Taste of Honey, I Saw Her Standing There, Baby It's You, and P.S. I Love You. So here the differences were not that great between the 2 cuts. Some of the songs did have more pronounced variations, but the quality of sound is similar, I would say. For P.S. I Love You, there was almost no difference between the 2 versions, whereas for the other 3 songs, there were a few things on the stereo that were noticeable. It seems that the stereo mix has some additional reverb, voices were panned heavily to the right channel, and at some point some of the instrumental parts could be distinguished better, like the guitars and some of the percussion, which probably were like that because of the heavy channel separation more than the sound actually being cleaner. This is also supported by how some effects like clapping for I Saw Her Standing There were heavily panned left. I can also say that I perceive the stereo version to be a little bit louder than the mono one. But other than that, I didn't really distinguish a significant quality difference in the clarity of sound between the two versions. If I were to choose a preferable version to listen to, I would probably go with the mono, just because the stereo did not sound significantly better. And at least with the mono version, you don't have the voices being too distracting by coming out of only one channel, especially on headphones. With the Beatles. Here are the 4 songs that I picked to test for this one. All My Lovin', Till There Was You, Roll Over Beethoven, and It Won't Be Long. On this album, the differences between the stereo and the mono versions of these songs are more noticeable. In stereo, on All My Loving, on the portions where the voice is absent, the right channel just sounds completely empty, so it's really strange to listen to. Until There Was You, the voice is a little bit more centered because you can hear a little faint trace of it from the left channel as well, and you have a clearer separation of the musical elements in stereo. But in the mono version, the voice takes center stage, and that's really important for this song. So we can say that the mono cut would be a better listen. For Roll Over Beethoven, this one sounds sharper in stereo. Otherwise, there isn't any big advantage to either of the two options. While for It Won't Be Long, we have a very nice mono mix with a perfect shifting focus on the various elements and a perfect balance between them. In conclusion, even though some of the stereo mixes on this album are quite pleasant to listen to and have their advantages, overall I still feel like the mono mix is the better version to listen to, at least in headphones. A Hard Day's Night. Now, this is where things start to take a little turn towards stereo maybe. Songs I've chosen for this one are the title track, plus I Should Have Known Better, and I Love Her, and If I Fell. To start with, there's a point that I think Andrew from Parallelogram made in one of his videos, and I think I saw it also discussed on some of the Beatles-centered forums, which is that the opening chord on A Hard Day's Night sounds different in stereo versus the mono version. In fact, it sounds different on the stereo version of this album from this box set versus renditions even in stereo of the same song from other discs, like compilations or previously released stereo versions of the album itself. Now, I've listened to this song a lot when I was a kid, and I don't really have in my mind the correct pitch of how this chord should sound, but what I can say about this opening chord on the 2009 stereo mix is that it sounded like it's at a lower pitch, a little bit heavier than it sounds on all of the other discs that I have, which include this song. So I'm just assuming, also based on what Andrew had said, that there was something wrong in transferring the beginning of the song from the master tapes to the stereo mix from 2009. But otherwise, I have no problem with the song or the rest of the album. So this is the only thing that sounds a little bit weird to me. It does sound weird, but it doesn't sound necessarily wrong. I do welcome any comments from people who know more about this or have a more informed opinion on what happened with this opening chord. But moving on, for A Hard Day's Night, the title track, my impression was that the stereo version is sharper sounding than the mono one, which I definitely don't dislike. I actually kind of like it, and it's a good thing that for this one at least, the voice is distributed through the channels, and so you don't have to hear that weird panning of the voice on only the right channel, which has happened for most of the previous stereo mixed songs. Voices also seemed clearer for me on the stereo on both songs I Should Have Known Better and If I Fell, and I would say that the mono mixes sounded just a little bit softer. With I Should Have Known Better specifically, vocals take center stage and are coming across really clearly on the stereo mix, and there is a slightly enjoyable panning of the guitar at the end of the song from one channel to the other. And finally, And I Love Her. Here as well there is an additional softness and warmth of the mono mix, but the song really sounded great to me on both mono and stereo. My conclusion for A Hard Day's Night is that I would prefer to listen to the stereo mix, at least when comparing between these two 2009 releases. Beatles For Sale. For this one, I chose I'll Follow the Sun, Mr. Moonlight, Rock and Roll Music, and What You're Doing. The mono mix of I'll Follow the Sun, of course, sounds excellent. On the stereo there is some extra reverb, but otherwise the fact that the voice is heard in both channels, and so it's a little bit more centered, makes the stereo mix a quite enjoyable one. Now, Mr. Moonlight is not a song that many Beatles fans appreciate, but for me, it's one of the finest covers that they've made. I think it's a really good vehicle for John's voice, as well as being a nice foray into the types of music that the Beatles appreciated themselves, and the music that they were inspired from. Even the organ portions, which a lot of people say sound too corny maybe, to me they just invoke a sense of nostalgia for the sounds of the 30s, 40s and 50s. I plan to do a video in the future listing some of my favorite Beatles songs from each album and create like a virtual compilation of my preferences, and in that one I will talk a little bit more about some of the songs like Mr. Moonlight. But until then, for Mr. Moonlight, in the stereo version the guitar and the bass seem to be panned to the left, while the organ is panned to the right, and it seemed to me like the organ is a little bit lower volume than expected in the stereo. While in the mono version the bass is more prevalent, it's stronger, the organ too can be distinguished better, and the organ solo on the mono version sounded even more vintage. For rock and roll music, just seems to be, like for many of the early album songs mixed in stereo, a slight more reverb on it. But otherwise I found it to be a very similar to the mono mix. I couldn't really distinguish important differences in the quality of sound. And for the last song on this list, What You're Doing, this song to me in stereo sounded definitely sharper. I could hear and distinguish the drumming a little bit better from the left channel, but otherwise both mixes sounded pretty good in their own way. Overall, for this album, I would prefer the mono mix, just because it seemed to me like some of the songs that I've listened to just sounded like they were mixed and balanced better in mono. It's probably also due to the fact that, as I said in other videos, but also a lot of people have been saying for years, the Beatles at that time and George Martin, their producer, were prioritizing the mono mixes to a very high degree, and the stereo mixes they just left at the end of the process and they just threw them together as fast as possible, because the more popular listening devices for the people who bought the records were mono devices. That doesn't mean all of the early stereo mixes are bad, but they will just become increasingly better as the years go on. And of course, some of the remixes in the past decades have improved a lot on what was happening then. But it's clear to me that at least for these early albums, some of the stereo mixes that were taken from that time are sometimes a little bit weird to listen to, especially the panning of certain instruments or voices that was done in a certain way. At least in headphones, some of them can be a weird listen. So for this album, again, we are just staying with mono, just because some of the mono mixes of the songs that I've listened to seem to be better balanced than the stereo ones. Today we're going to close here, but next time we'll continue with the following 4 albums chronologically. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you'll return for the second episode. See you next time.